I grew up in Ghana in a rural community. As in most Australian rural communities, there were and there are no high schools in African villages, in Ghanaian villages. So after primary school, I had to go to boarding school in a nearby town. On one of my holidays back in the village, I accompanied my parents to the field. My father entered a conversation with me. He wanted to know from me the sort of things we were being taught at school. For some reason, I was struggling to explain to him what we were being taught. He looked into my face and said, "Our son, if we send you to boarding school and you can't come back to this village and make what you are learning relevant to the needs of this village, then what is the point of you going to school?" Reflecting on experiences such as this led me to routinely ask the question, how do I make my learning, my education, and subsequently my research, how do I make my research relevant to people? And I think that is the starting point. With that type of formative experience, reflecting back on it led me to a lifetime involvement in community development related social research. And by community development research, basically working with communities of people, no matter how defined. It can be village groups, it can be organizations, working with women's groups, men's groups, any communities of people. As researchers and educators, how do we work with communities of people to enable them develop reflective understanding of their own situations and the strategies that can help them improve their own situation? So I started in this sort of work fairly early back in Ghana, and I was involved in working with rural communities as part of teams, improving education, building clinics, building schools, improving education and health facilities, in providing income generation opportunities in rural areas. And subsequently, I migrated to Australia back in the 1990s. And of course, having spent most of my formative years working with my own people in Ghana, rural Ghana, working with my own communities in terms of community improvement, I found myself in Australia and an entirely different socioeconomic environment. The challenge for me was how to function or how to operate in terms of working with communities along the same ways I was doing in Ghana. And this was particularly challenging as well, because although I identified Indigenous Australia as one of the areas I was interested in working, a frequent comment I got from most people in the 1990s, and with a number of Indigenous people in the 1990s, when I first came to Australia and introduced myself as a researcher, a common response I got was that Indigenous people have been researched to death. And so really, as an outsider, where to start was a challenge. Looking back on some of my formative experiences, I've asked basic questions such as, look, what are Indigenous people themselves doing to improve their own situation despite obvious challenges? And how can my research be relevant to Indigenous people's needs and aspirations? That naturally led me into evaluation type of research, developing relationships with Indigenous health services, education organizations, and other community groups. And one of the areas I identified Indigenous people were putting a lot of effort into is the whole area of promoting well-being and the concept of empowerment. Given the history of Australia, given the history of colonization and disempowerment that are associated with the process, engaging with indigenous organizations, I discovered fairly early that indigenous people are talking about strategies, ways in which indigenous people and organizations could be empowered to promote their own well-being. And hence I thought one of the areas that could be relevant is really to engage with the whole concept of empowerment and well-being promotion.